Chapter 1. The Murderous Pouch. The wind howled like sharp blades slicing through the air, freezing everything in its path. The world was lifeless, trapped beneath a blanket of snow, like fish laid out on an icy chopping block. The snow stretched endlessly across the land, turning the sky into a vast sea of white salt. The relentless wind and snowfall refused to cease, plunging everything into a haunting silence. A lone carriage trundled down from the north, its wheels crunching through the frozen snow, scattering icy blossoms onto the roadside. Despite the clattering of hooves and the creaking of the carriage, the desolate landscape remained undisturbed, shrouded in a veil of quiet mourning. Inside the carriage, David Lin sneezed several times, adjusting his posture in an attempt to find comfort. The leopard skin draped interior offered warmth, but life's cruel twist had left him cold, both in body and soul. David sighed deeply, muttering to himself, "Humans are born into contradictions. No matter how much we try to avoid it, we can't escape." Reaching into the corner, he retrieved a wine flask. Removing the stopper, he peered inside before tilting his head back and taking a long, deep drink. As the last drop slid down his throat, a violent coughing fit overtook him, forcing him to double over. His pale face, already chilled by the cold, flushed crimson as he struggled to catch his breath. The persistent cough was a constant companion, a chronic reminder of his frailty. When it subsided, David examined the empty flask with a wistful expression. Then, pulling out a thin blade, he began carving into the flask. The blade danced with practiced precision, tracing elegant lines that soon formed the delicate features of a woman. Her beauty seemed to radiate from the carving, so vivid that it appeared almost lifelike. It wasn't just the skill of the craftsman, it was his soul poured into every detail. David's face bore the wear of many hardships. The crow's feet at his eyes etched deeply into his weathered features. Yet his bright, piercing gaze held a quiet kindness, a depth that spoke of an indomitable spirit. When he finished, he stared at the carving for a long moment before stepping out into the cold. Snowflakes clung to his shoulders, his breath misting in the air as he knelt and buried the flask in the snow. He mounded the snow over it, forming a small grave, and stood silently before it. His stillness was one of profound sorrow, as though he were bidding farewell to a loved one. The coachman, a burly man with sharp, hawk-like eyes, watched him from the carriage. Despite his imposing appearance, his expression softened with a loyal, almost dog-like devotion. "Master David, the day grows dark, and the road is still long. Perhaps you should return to the carriage," he said gently. David turned, his sharp eyes catching sight of a trail of footprints near the carriage. The footprints were deep, left by someone who had walked a great distance and was now utterly spent. "A lonely soul," David murmured, "wandering through this biting cold. How pitiful." The coachman's gaze spoke what his lips did not. "Are you not a lonely soul yourself, Master David? Why pity others and forget your own plight?" The carriage resumed its journey, crunching through the snow as David returned to his carving. Piece after piece of what became a likeness of the same woman, his blade moving with tireless precision. The snow-covered trees stretched endlessly into the horizon, painting a bleak picture of frost and silence. But soon, faint footsteps broke the stillness. Though soft, the crunch of boots on snow reached David's finely tuned ears. Pushing aside the leopard skin curtain, he peered out. A lone figure appeared, a shadow against the white expanse, walking steadily but unhurriedly. Snow fell on the figure's unprotected head, melting and streaming down their neck, soaking their tattered clothes. Yet the figure walked on, spine straight and unyielding, like steel forged in fire. As the carriage drew closer, David saw that the figure was a young man with thick brows, piercing eyes, and lips pressed into a firm line. His expression was cold and detached, as though he were indifferent to the world and even his own existence. He was young, too young to be a man, yet his icy demeanor carried a strange, almost magnetic allure. David leaned out of the carriage and called, "Hop on, I'll give you a ride." It was a simple offer, but one that carried weight in the freezing wilderness. The young man didn't respond. He kept walking, his gaze fixed ahead as though he hadn't heard. "Are you deaf?" David asked with a laugh. Slowly, the young man's hand moved to the hilt of the odd weapon at his side. His movements were deliberate and calculated, like a craftsman perfecting his art. David chuckled again. "So, you're not deaf. Come on, have a drink to warm up. A little wine won't hurt anyone." "I don't drink," the young man replied curtly. David grinned. But it's free wine." The young man's tone sharpened. "If it's not mine, I won't keep it. If it's not mine, I won't drink it. Have I made myself clear?" David nodded. "Crystal clear." The young man flicked his gaze toward David. "Good. Then move along." David chuckled, waving dismissively. "Very well. But when you're the one offering the wine, remember to save me a cup." The young man continued walking, his silhouette shrinking into the distance. As the carriage rolled on, David remarked to the coachman, "That boy is an odd one. He's no ordinary person. For all his bluntness, there's a sincerity to him almost childlike." The coachman shrugged. "He's just another stubborn kid, nothing more." David's eyes narrowed. "Did you see his weapon?" The coachman chuckled. "That toy? It's just a piece of scrap metal. Hardly a weapon." David sighed. "That toy is exceedingly dangerous. Best not to underestimate him." The coachman fell silent, the weight of David's words lingering as the carriage continued its journey. Chapter 2. The Wandering Knight. The carriage rolled away from the inn, loaded with jars of wine bought with the 50 taels the young man had earned. He poured cup after cup for himself, drinking deeply, savoring the taste of each sip as if washing away the bitter cold. David Lin watched him with quiet amusement, a faint smile tugging at his lips as the young man indulged with enthusiasm. The snow beneath the carriage had frozen into a thick, icy sheet, gleaming like glass. To ensure safe passage, the coachman had fitted the horses with spiked horseshoes, and the wheels were reinforced with iron chains. Despite the slippery terrain, the carriage moved steadily forward. Suddenly, the young man set his cup down and turned to David, his gaze sharp and direct. "Why did you invite me onto this carriage to drink?" he asked bluntly. David chuckled softly. "Because the inn isn't a place to linger." The young man frowned. "Why not?" David leaned back, his expression calm. "After killing someone, trouble tends to follow. I don't fear killing, but I do hate unnecessary complications." The young man fell silent for a moment, then reached for the wine jar, filling his cup to the brim before drinking it all in one swift motion. David watched him with a look of approval, as though recognizing a kindred spirit in the young man's straightforwardness. After a pause, the young man sighed. "Killing isn't something to celebrate, but some people simply need to die. When it comes to them, I have no choice but to kill." David's smile widened slightly. "Did you really kill Blake for the 50 taels?" The young man's response was as blunt as ever. "Even without the 50 taels, I'd have killed him. But getting paid for it? That's just a bonus." David raised an eyebrow. "And yet you only asked for 50 taels?" The young man shrugged. That's all he was worth. David laughed, the sound warm yet tinged with melancholy. "There are many more in the martial world who deserve to die, and some of them are worth far more than 50 taels. If you keep this up, you might become very rich. And I'll never run out of wine." The young man smirked faintly. "It's a pity I'm poor now. Otherwise, I'd have given you 50 taels myself." David's curiosity deepened. "Oh, and for what?" "For killing Lucas," the young man replied, his tone even. David's laughter carried a note of disdain. "His life isn't worth a single coin." David's tone shifted to a more serious one as he asked, "Do you know why Lucas tried to kill you?" The young man shook his head. don't understand his actions at all. David explained, the bloodied twin serpents may have spared his life, but the encounter destroyed his reputation in the martial world. When you killed Blake, the only way he could redeem himself was by killing you. That way, he could claim that his earlier humiliation was all part of a grand strategy, sacrificing pride in the short term to achieve ultimate victory. The martial world is full of deceit and treachery, things you may not yet comprehend. The young man nodded thoughtfully. Human malice can indeed surpass that of beasts. Beasts kill to survive. Their actions are driven by instinct and self-preservation. Humans, on the other hand, kill for gain or sometimes for no reason at all. From what I've seen, humans kill more often than beasts ever do. David studied the young man closely, his expression softening. Is that why you only befriend beasts? The young man's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. Too bad they don't drink wine. It was the first time David had seen him smile, a heartfelt, unguarded expression. In that moment, the young man's cold, solitary demeanor melted away, revealing a warmth and charm that was utterly disarming. David found himself moved by the transformation. You must be someone of great renown, the young man said suddenly, his tone curious. David chuckled. Renown isn't necessarily a good thing. The young man's gaze grew earnest. But I want to be famous. I want to be known throughout the world. His voice carried the sincerity of a child sharing their dearest dream. David smiled knowingly. Everyone harbors ambitions, no matter how much they deny it. Even those who claim to disdain fame and fortune secretly crave recognition. At least you're honest about it. The young man shook his head. My desire for fame isn't like that. If I don't achieve it, I'll die. David's brow furrowed. Why is that? The young man didn't answer. His expression darkened, a flicker of sorrow crossing his features. David noticed a shift and refrained from pressing further. Beneath the young man's youthful exterior, he sensed a deep well of pain and misfortune. Softening his tone, David said, if you want to make a name for yourself, you should start by sharing your name. After a long pause, the young man finally replied, those who know me call me Leo. David nodded thoughtfully. Leo, is that your family name? I've never heard it before. Leo shook his head. I have no surname. His eyes burned with defiance, a fiery determination that seemed unquenchable. David chose not to pry further, sensing that Leo's past was a burden he wasn't ready to share. When I make a name for myself, I'll reveal my true identity, Leo said. Until then, David smiled gently. Until then, Leo it is. They raised their cups in unison. To Leo, David said, his voice warm. As they drank, David's persistent cough returned, racking his body with violent spasms. Leo watched silently, his gaze sharp with curiosity. It seemed strange that someone as frail as David could navigate the perilous martial world. When David's coughing subsided, he smiled wryly. Do you know why I like having you as a companion? Without waiting for an answer, he continued. Because you're the only friend who doesn't scold me for drinking while I cough. Leo frowned. Does coughing mean you shouldn't drink? David laughed softly. Doctors would say so, but I've never let that stop me. Leo's voice turned serious. Do you drink because of some great burden you carry? David's smile faded slightly as he glanced at Leo. Did I ever ask about your burdens? Your family? Your master? Your past? Leo shook his head. No, you didn't. Then why ask about mine? David's tone was calm, but carried an edge of sadness. Leo held his gaze for a moment before breaking into a wry smile. You're right. I shouldn't ask. David laughed, raising his cup again, but before he could drink, the carriage abruptly stopped. What's the matter? He called to the coachman. There's something blocking the road, came the reply. David frowned. What is it? The coachman chuckled. A snowman. They both stepped out of the carriage to investigate. In the middle of the road stood a large snowman with lumps of coal for eyes. Leo's expression was unreadable as he stared at it, as though he'd never seen such a thing before. David chuckled. Never seen a snowman? It's just a game children in the North like to play. Sometimes adults join in when they're bored. Leo's tone was cold. Snow is nothing but a nuisance. It freezes the world, kills plants, drives animals away. It brings cold and hunger, leaving desolation in its wake. As he spoke, he scooped up a handful of snow, packed it into a ball, and hurled it into the distance. To the well-fed and well-clothed, snow might be a thing of beauty. But to me, his voice trailed off and his gaze grew distant. David's expression softened. I don't mind the snow. What I do mind are those who block my path. Picking up a snowball, he hurled it at the snowman. When the snow fell away, it revealed something shocking beneath, a frozen corpse. Leo's eyes narrowed. "Blake," he exclaimed. Chapter 3. The Treasure That Stirs Greed. David Lin stepped closer, observing Trent's body slumped against a wooden pillar. A hole in his throat had been sealed with snow, the blood frozen in place. The killer, it seemed, had used the snow to prevent blood from spilling onto themselves. The strike was executed with extraordinary precision, swift and deadly. The blade had pierced and withdrawn so quickly that Trent's body had remained upright, propped against the pillar. Before the blow, Trent must have attempted to resist, but the opponent's speed had been overwhelming, leaving no chance for defense. David's expression showed a flicker of astonishment. Trent had been a renowned fighter for over 2 decades, a name feared throughout the Central Plains. Yet, he had been killed without so much as a struggle. It was unthinkable, and this was not the work of someone attacking from behind. David turned and entered the tavern. The room was stark and barren, with no menus or furniture, a clear sign it had ceased operations during the harsh winter. Inside, the scene was chilling. For corpses arranged in a cross pattern, their feet touching in the center and their heads pointing outward. Each of the 5 venom children from the blissful cavern had been killed, their throats pierced cleanly by a sword. Silver bangles lay scattered around them, and on their faces lingered faint, sinister smiles. In the corner, Nate, known as Shadowless Walker, was sprawled against a pillar. His hands clutched his deadly throwing weapons, but he hadn't had the chance to use them before a sword had ended his life. David murmured, "Such extraordinary speed. Unimaginable." 2 days earlier, David would not have been able to guess who could wield a blade with such precision and swiftness. The finest swordsman of a generation, the fabled snow falcon of the heavenly mountains, had retired after a legendary duel at Eagle Sorrow Gorge. Others, Tran Lang, the wandering Meow Blade, or Victor Wong, had vanished into seclusion. No one else in the martial world could match such skill. At least, that's what David would have thought 2 days ago. But now he knew. There was one person, the young man with the peculiar name, Leo. David closed his eyes, envisioning the deadly confrontation. The venomous disciples had surrounded Leo, their laughter and the jingling of their silver bangles filling the air. Yet, in an instant, their throats had been pierced almost simultaneously. Nate, known for his exceptional agility and accuracy with throwing weapons, had been no match. Leo's sword had found its mark before Nate could even raise his hand. Opening his eyes, David noticed a series of words etched into the wooden pillar. "You killed Lucas for me. I killed these for you. I do not wish to owe you anything. A man should never be indebted." David chuckled softly. He killed 6 for my 1 and says he doesn't owe me. Yet here I am, indebted to him. The message continued. "Though I killed more, the circumstances differ. You killed 1 who could have faced 6, so we're even. I dislike being indebted." David couldn't help but laugh aloud. Such calculations. He'd make a terrible merchant. Beneath the text was an arrow etched into the wood. Following its direction, David stepped through a doorway and heard a startled gasp. A sword pointed at his face, trembling in the hands of its wielder, a chubby, middle-aged man with wrinkles that betrayed his age. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice quivering despite his effort to sound brave. David smiled gently. "Don't you recognize me?" The man shook his head. David continued, "But I recognize you. You're the tavern owner. 10 years ago, we shared a drink together. Have you forgotten?" The man squinted, trying to place him. "Your name, sir?" "Lin. My name is David Lin." David replied with a faint smile. The man's face lit up. "Ah, David Lin, the former imperial scholar. Forgive me for not recognizing you immediately." David's brow furrowed. "You've been waiting for me?" The man nodded quickly. "An extraordinary young hero came through earlier. He defeated several villains and left one alive, saying you'd come to deal with him. He also said if I failed to deliver the captive to you, I'd lose my life." David's expression grew serious. "Where is he?" "Out back, by the kitchen." The tavern owner led the way, and David followed closely. Bound to a chair sat a thin man with a distinctive tuft of black hair near his ear, Harrison. His eyes darted nervously when he saw David, fear flickering across his face. Though Leo had tied him up and gagged him, David could tell the captive hadn't expected to meet him again. David removed the gag, and Harrison immediately began trembling. "What's your name?" David asked as he sat across from him, pouring himself a drink. "H. Harrison," the man stammered. David smiled faintly. "Well, Harrison, would you care for a drink?" David cut the ropes with his small carving knife and offered Harrison a cup of wine. The man's hands were shaking so badly, he spilled half the contents onto his clothes. David sighed, ashamed to waste good wine. "You know, wine should be savored, not squandered. And honesty, well, that's a virtue I value greatly. Perhaps you'd like to show your gratitude by telling me where the pouch is." Harrison froze. "Pouch? What pouch?" David's smile faded. "Let's not waste time. Where is it?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Harrison protested weakly. David's expression turned cold. "Lying after drinking my wine? That won't do." He raised the knife, pressing its tip lightly against Harrison's chest. "Perhaps I should retrieve the wine directly from your stomach." Harrison's face drained of color. "Wait, I'll tell you." David lowered the knife, watching as Harrison finally admitted to stealing the pouch, which contained the famed golden silk armor. As Harrison revealed the details, David's expression remained calm, but his mind was already calculating the next steps. To be continued.